Okay, um, welcome back to the series on intertextuality between the Quran and Judeo-Christian traditions. I'm going to start by sort of summarizing uh, some of the things we talked about last time, and then we'll go into today's 10 examples, right? So I started off by talking about how even Orientalists now recognize you have to look at the Quran and see how it interacts with these different Judeo-Christian traditions, and that the old view that the Quran was just copying from the Bible and it jumbled up some stories and this and that, which is what Christians used to say. It's really disappearing and is not at all the dominant view anymore. The next thing I pointed out was how the Prophet Muhammad could not read and write, and in fact Arabia as a whole could not read and write. It was an illiterate nation. Almost no one could read or write, and this is established by history. Um, I talked about how many of these texts that the Quran is engaging with, these biblical and extra biblical materials, many of them were untranslated texts, right? For example, the Bible had not been translated. The Talmud actually was just translated like 8-9 years ago. And we also find some lost texts being dealt with. And interestingly, today we're going to look at some examples from Egyptian history. We're going to see how the Quran is interacting with the Exodus story from a Egyptian history point of view, right? And that's a lost text. And many times the Quran is correcting these Judeo-Christian traditions. Next thing I mentioned was how even the Bible are just a bunch of traditions. So I gave the example of Deuteronomy 34, which is supposed to have been written by Moses, yet talking about how Moses has been dead for a long time. Genesis 12:6, talking about this is a verse which shows that Moses did not write it, because it says at that time the Canaanites were in the land, but when Moses is writing it, the Canaanites are in the land, so it only makes sense post Joshua. I showed you the rabbinic rabbis who recognize this as well. I gave you the example of Luke clearly talking about how he is not inspired, right? That's not what he's saying in his gospel, but rather that he's just a historian who's collecting these traditions. He mentions eyewitnesses, but we don't really know who any of these eyewitnesses are. It's just an anonymous source, and of course the gospels are anonymous. I give you the example of how Mark was the first gospel, and then Matthew and Luke used it as a source, and Matthew would change Mark to fit Jesus into his view of who Jesus was, right? So the two-source hypothesis, which is what most scholars know, that Mark was written first, and Matthew and Luke copied from it, and they made changes. I gave you the example of how you cannot believe the New Testament or the actual sayings of Jesus is if you believe in him, because he makes a lot of false prophecies, for example, saying that his return would be in that generation when they were still living, right? Then I refuted the idea that by generation it meant race. Then I talked about how the prophet was sincere, so I gave the example of the sun eclipsing, and people saying the sun eclipsed because the prophet's child died. Now, if he was a false prophet, he would have used this to say, look, God made this miracle happen because of me, but he did not. I gave you the example of the Arabs recognizing him as trustworthy even before Islam. We looked at how the prophet was in hunger, right? He spent many nights hungry, even though he could have had food. He could have been like the king of the Arabs if he wanted to, because he had that power and authority. But he chose not to, right? He clearly did not have these worldly motives. I showed you how he used to weep in his prayers. He used to pray sometimes half the night or more than half the night, 2/3 of the night, 1/3 of the night, etc., etc. I talked about how he was the bravest man in battle, and even when on one occasion when many of the companions fled from the battle, he was still in the front lines charging forward. I talked about how he, at one point, sent the bodyguards away because he said, God will protect me from now on, because a verse was revealed that God is going to protect you, and so he said, I don't need bodyguards. I showed you how at one point the Quraysh came and offered the Prophet all these worldly things in case he had a worldly motive, and he said no to them, right? It shows you he did not have a worldly motive. Talked about how he won and led military battles even at 3-to-1 odds, and the fact that he established a state with spiritual laws, with a religion and these laws, right? government laws and spiritual laws, etc. He civilized a nation that used to bury their daughters, so he can't really be mad, right? I talked to you about how people would have noticed if he was being taught, right? So most of these stories about the previous nations are actually revealed in Mecca, which was the city the Prophet used to live in. And in that nation, there was no Jewish or Christian communities at all. There was no knowledge of these stories. But in Medina, which is where the Prophet then migrated to, there were Jewish communities, right? So interestingly, most of these stories were actually revealed in Mecca. But even in Medina, he could not have been copying or getting this knowledge from other people, even when there were Jewish communities where he could have learned from. Why? Because the people would have noticed, right? Because the hadith are extremely detailed. There were people around the Prophet 24/7, right? So, for example, we even know how many white hair are on the Prophet's head. So, if he was going to a rabbi or someone to learn all this from, people would have noticed, right? So, I gave you the example of how Suleiman Dos, who's an Orientalist, mentions that the Medina hadiths are so detailed, they're like a diary of the Prophet's life. We talked about how, again, none of the Arabs knew these stories, and I gave the example of how the Quran mentions this too, right? And so it makes no sense if that people would believe in him when the Prophet was reciting these verses that the Arabs did not know about these stories. If the Arabs knew about these stories, that would be a ridiculous verse. People wouldn't take him seriously, and no one would believe in him. Talked about how the Arabs accused a foreigner of teaching him, and how that foreigner didn't even know Arabic, so how was he going to teach the Prophet, right? And that shows you, like, when he was in Mecca, they at one point accused this foreigner of teaching him, who was someone's slave, is what he was, and he didn't know anything. He couldn't even speak Arabic. But the fact that they accused this foreigner man shows you they didn't know the stories. The Arabs did not know the stories, so they thought, so they accused that maybe this foreigner was teaching him, right? And it was a ridiculous suggestion because he couldn't, again, speak Arabic. And the interesting thing is, they did not point to a rabbi or a Christian scholar because there were no rabbis or Christian scholars around. The one they pointed to was just some random guy's slave. I talked to you about how the Bible had not been translated in Arabic. Even we have this hadith that the Jews in Medina, when the Prophet migrated to Medina, some of the Muslims would go to the rabbis and they would teach them the Torah in Hebrew. They would read the Torah in Hebrew, then translate it in Arabic, which shows you again they did not have an Arabic Bible at the time, and Orientalists confirmed this too. Talked about again how the Talmud had not been translated. And then there are a lot of examples I'm going to show you. There are more than 40, a few more than 40 right now. Probably have like 44 right now. So in this episode, we're going to go through 10 of those. 10 of these examples. So as you can see, here's a chart to show you how most of these stories of biblical stories were revealed in Mecca, not Medina, right? And no one in Mecca knew these stories. So, what's the point of this exercise? Well, it's interesting to look at the Quran through these biblical lens and how it interacts with them, right? So we're looking at the intertextuality between the Quran and Judeo-Christian traditions, biblical and extra-biblical, how the Quran has intimate knowledge of these Hebrew, Greek, Syriac texts, many of which were untranslated and in different areas. Yet the Quran will reference or respond to them, right? Shows you the author of the Quran clearly knew these texts and languages, yet Muhammad couldn't read or write, nor could the Arabs as a whole. In fact, the Arabs were unfamiliar with even the basic biblical stories. This proves Islam, especially when you put it together with the other things we know about Islam and the Quran. And Muhammad, like the Quran's literary miracle, the prophecies of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the historical miracles of the Quran, which there are a few of them, the biblical prophecies of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which I'm going to do a video on. It might come out later because I'm waiting for the Michael Brown debate and for Zakir Hussein's book to come out. Also, the message of Islam and it being far superior to every other religion, the miraculous expansion of Islam, etc. So there are so many proofs. So when you put it all together, right? You put everything together, it's very clear that Muhammad is a prophet, and when you take this argument into account, especially when you take it into account with the other arguments, it becomes so clear because the author of the Quran knows these texts, so he's an expert in these Judeo-Christian texts, many of them, again, which were in different languages. Yet Muhammad was, unable to even read or write Arabic in a nation that had no knowledge of these biblical stories. So he's clearly an expert in these things, even though there was no way he could have learned them. And then he has all these prophecies, and then the Quran is a literary miracle. No one could have replicated. No one had the ability to replicate it, which means he's a an if you're saying Muhammad made all this up, so he's an expert in all these different things, and somehow is able to come with all these miracles, and the prophecies just happen to all be guesswork and all that, and at some point it just becomes extremely ridiculous. So, just to recap the examples we looked at before, we looked at the donkeys on the back / the lolling dog example, how the Quran uses that midrash and turns it on its head. We looked at how the Quran responds to the idea that God rested after creating the heavens and earth and was refreshed. We talked about how the Quran responds to the idea that Solomon disbelieved. We talked about the Queen of Sheba and how she had hairy legs. Again, the date for that and some of the others, or a couple of the other stories that I'm going to mention in one point about how the Quran mentions certain narratives that were unknown at the time. That's going to be in the future. Some of those dates are unknown, as in there's debate about whether they're pre-Quranic or if the Quran is before, but because they're around about the same time. Or maybe they can be dated a century before the Quran or maybe after. So there's some debate about these things. But generally, many of these are pre-Quranic. We talked about Mary not being unchaste, direct response to the Talmud, Mary being the sister of Aaron, or calling to mind Syriac texts, Jesus being like Adam, which is mentioned in the New Testament, the fact that they did not kill him nor crucify him, meaning the Messiah, and also how the Messiah won't be killed, how that reflects biblical prophecies, right? So we talked about how the Jews in the Talmud mentioned that they killed Jesus first, they stoned him, then they crucified him post-mortem, right? That's a very, normally when you think about Jesus being crucified, they just mention crucifixion, but the Quran goes out of its way to first mention not being killed, then not being crucified, and how that perfectly matches the Jewish claim, and interestingly, the Quran is responding to the Jews when it says it, so it's interesting that it uses that exact same language as in the Talmud, which is very strange language. It's a strange claim, and the Quran responds to that directly. And also how the Quranic language, we went through the prophecies which showed that the Messiah is going to have a near-death experience and then be saved. People are going to come after him. They're going to plot and plan after him. They're going to try and kill him, and then God will rescue him and draw him up to himself. And we looked at these verses which showed clearly that the author of the Quran is aware of this. Let's look at these verses. وَمَكَرُوا وَمَكَرَ اللَّهُ وَاللَّهُ خَيْرُ الْمَاكِرِينَ. And they planned, and Allah planned, and Allah is the best of planners. Speaking about how the Jews plan to kill Jesus. إِذْ قَالَ اللَّهُ يَا عِيسَى إِنِّي مُتَوَفِّيكَ وَرَافِعُكَ إِلَيَّ وَمُطَهِّرُكَ مِنَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا وَجَاعِلُ الَّذِينَ اتَّبَعُوكَ فَوْقَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا إِلَى يَوْمِ الْقِيَامَةِ ثُمَّ إِلَيَّ مَرْجِعُكُمْ فَأَحْكُمُ بَيْنَكُمْ فِيمَا كُنْتُمْ فِيهِ تَخْتَلِفُونَ. When Allah said, O Jesus, indeed I will take you and raise you to myself and purify you from those who disbelieve and make those who follow you superior to those who disbelieve until the day of resurrection. Then to me is your return, and I will judge between you concerning in that which you used to differ. Right? And also interestingly, I wanted to point out that Rudolf Bultmann and many scholars point out Jesus didn't make the predictions about his death, but the gospel writers put them in his mouth. Because you notice, for example, things don't make sense, like the fact that Jesus was praying to be saved from crucifixion for like 3 hours, and he was sweating blood, and how if he was telling people he was going to die and then resurrect, then when the disciples are told that Jesus is resurrected, they think it's all fairy tales and this and that, and they don't believe it. How that doesn't make any sense. If Jesus was actually going around preaching, I'm going to die and then be resurrected. We gave the example of Jesus not being a magician or idolater, which is in response to the in Allah's conversation with Jesus on Judgment Day. And finally, I mentioned the extremes regarding Jesus. So that's it for the summary of what we talked about before. Now let's get straight into the new material for today, starting with the first example, which is that of prostrations. Now, interestingly, right, the Quran talks about a monotheism a lot, and worshiping God alone a lot, right? Yet it will give a couple stories which some might see to be puzzling at first, right? That you would think, well, of all the stories that could be included in the Quran. Why these two? In terms of specifically, I'm talking about the prostration stories. So there are a couple stories in the Quran. One story where the angels are told to prostrate to Adam, and the other story where the brothers of Joseph and his parents prostrate to Joseph. Now that's a very peculiar thing, right? Because you don't expect that from the Quran, but yet it does relate these stories. Uh, and of course, this is explained because in the in the past, these sorts of prostrations were allowed for the previous nations, but for this nation, uh, prostration to anyone else has been not allowed, right? And we see in the Bible as well cases where people are prostrating to men, right? Yet in this nation, which is the nation of Islam, that's not allowed anymore, right? So why would the Quran include these stories when prostration is no longer allowed? Interestingly, uh, there's an interesting paper on this called the Triological Anthropology, which looks at these different stories and talks about how actually they have a very interesting role when you consider the audience in mind, when you consider the Jewish, Christian, and Arab audience, which were then exposed to uh, these stories at its time, and in fact, these stories actually end up cementing monotheism and the worship of God alone very strongly. And so that's very interesting that when you take the audience in mind, it turns out these stories actually teach pure monotheism and they perfectly fit into the Quran. So let's look at, so I think this is a quote from the, let's see, what's this a quote from? But this is a version of the story, I believe, from the Jews, right? So the Jews have a similar story in one of their traditions, and it's not a biblical story, but it's found in their one of their traditions, and it reads as follows: "And they, meaning the angels, saw the right hand of God, which took dust from the earth, that is from the four elements, cold and heat, dry and humidity. Why did God create Adam from these four weak elements? So that through them all that is in him would be submitted to him. God formed Adam with his holy hands, and in his image, in his likeness. And as the angels saw his glorious appearance, they were moved by the beauty of his likeness. He stretched and he stood on the earth. He dressed in the dress of kingship and put the crown of glory on his head. And God gave him authority over all creatures and wild beasts, the cattle and the bird. And they passed before Adam, and he gave names to them while they bowed their heads and they prostrated before him and worshipped before him." Right? Now, this is a story I think from the Jews, but it might be from a Christian source uh, as well. But the idea is this story was actually around with the Jews and Christians of the time, and they were interpreting this same story in a very interesting way. So the way that Christians were looking at this, where they were making the comparison between Adam and Jesus. So we talked before about how even the New Testament makes this claim that Adam is like Jesus and he's a foreshadowing of Jesus. So they were looking at this story and they were going, well, someone is bowing down to, or the angels are bowing down to Adam in the beginning, and Adam is being described with all this language about how he was made with the holy hands in his image and in his likeness, and they were moved by the beauty of his likeness and this and that. So so Adam is almost being the way the Christians were looking at this. They were saying, well, Adam is almost like a divine being here, and what is being foreshadowed is that in the future the Messiah will come, Jesus, who will be like Adam, right? And this story sort of foreshadows that eventually in the future there will be a man, Jesus, who everyone is supposed to bow down to, and he will be God. Right? And so they were looking at these, the fact that it's using language to show that Adam was, made in the likeness and this and that of God, to show that this foreshadows Jesus' divinity and this and that. And so that's how the Christians were looking at this story. The Jews were looking at this story, and what interested them was how Adam gave the names to all the different things, right? So they were looking at the creativity of Adam and the creativity of human beings, and they were really focusing on that idea that it was Adam who named these all these different things, and that he just somehow knew the names, right? That's what Jewish tradition, how it interacts with these texts, that Adam just knew these names. And I think it's mentioned in the Bible too, how Adam gave all these things their names. Now, interestingly, what the Quran does in its story, right? And actually, let me just go over the rest of the stuff before I get to that. So So here's this from the paper. It shows you how the Quran recasts the Christian as well as the Jewish narratives about Adam and the angels within the framework of its own doctrines. With its own sense of an exclusivist monotheism, the Quran rejects claims about Adam's creative intelligence and innate divinity made by rabbis and by Christians in their respective versions of the same story. Right, so here is a quote from Midrash to Genesis 2:19. When the Holy One, blessed be He, was about to create humanity, He consulted with His ministering angels, saying, "Let us make Adam." The angels responded, "What's so wonderful about this Adam?" So He brought each creature before the angels and asked them, "This creature, what is its name?" But they did not know. Then He brought the creatures before Adam and asked him, "The creature, what is its name?" To which Adam responded, "This is Hebrew for ox. This is shamor, donkey." Right. So that quote was to show you how Jews were looking at this story, right? And of course, none of this was known in Mecca at the time, and of course, the Christians. You didn't really have Christians in Medina, which is Surah Al-Baqarah was revealed in Medina. So the idea is the Quran uses the story because it will be relevant to any Christians who come in contact with it. But in Medina, where the story was revealed, you didn't have Christians. Perhaps Jews knew about the story and had these interactions with it, but what we know is that these were Jews and Christians who had these ideas outside of Arabia, right? So all the what the author is talking about, how the Christians and Jews were looking at these stories, this is not known from the Arabian Jews and Christians, but rather from how Jews and Christians were looking at the story outside of Arabia, right? So they give the source of the Midrash, which is not in Arabia, but rather in a foreign land, and how, again, we know, again, the Christians who are looking at this also knew about the story from a foreign land, not from Arabia, right? So yet the Quran is going to interact with them. And so it's very interesting how the Quran does it. First of all, let's look at the emphasis on how God is the one who taught Adam the names of the angels, and how the praise is for God in this story. And that's right. So the praise is for God, not Adam, and it is God who taught Adam the names in the Quranic version of the story. Which, again, a lot of emphasis is placed on both of these two things: the fact that praise is for God, right, in this in the Quranic version of the story, which we didn't see beforehand, right? Last time in the version we saw upstairs here, the emphasis was on Adam, right, and how he was like Adam, and it was because of the fact that he resembled God, that they were struck by his beauty and this and that he named the angels, and that's what he named the different things, and that's what they mentioned here as well. So that's the Judeo-Christian tradition, but the Quranic tradition goes against these two ideas of Adam's divinity and his creativity very strongly, and rather attributes all the stuff to God. So let's read the story. وَإِذْ قَالَ رَبُّكَ لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ إِنِّي جَاعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً قالوا أتجعل فيها من يفسد فيها ويسفك الدماء ونحن نسبح بحمدك ونقدس لك قال إني أعلم ما لا تعلمون. And when your Lord said to the angels, "Indeed, I will make upon the earth a successive authority," they said, "Will you place upon it one who causes corruption therein and sheds blood, while we exhale to you with praise and declare your perfection?" He said, "Indeed, I know that which you do not know." So look what's being highlighted: God's praise, His perfection. Right. So it's used twice. نُسَبِّحُ بِحَمْدِكَ. We exhale your praise and thank you. وَنُقَدِّسُ لَكَ. And declare your perfection. So there's a lot of emphasis being praise being placed here. Both things are mentioned, exalting his praise and thanks, and also declaring his perfection. He said, "Indeed, I know what you do not know." So the emphasis on God's knowledge is put here, that God knows. And we're going to see how the rest of the story is all about God's, or the next few verses are all about God's knowledge as well. وَأَلَّمَ آدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا ثُمَّ عَرَضَهُمْ عَلَى الْمَلَائِكَةِ فَقَالَ أَنْبِئُونِي بِأَسْمَاءِ هَؤُلَاءِ إِن كُنتُمْ صَادِقِينَ. And he taught Adam the names, all of them. Then he showed them to the angels and then said, "Inform me of the names of these if you are truthful." Right? So look at this. He taught Adam the names. So it's no longer Adam just looking at things and knowing their names from his creativity and this and that. And I believe in the Kabbalah they state how, it's because of the nature of objects and this and that, but that wasn't around at the time. But we can clearly see that there's a shift. Now God is teaching Adam the names. And look before how the praise was for God and the perfection was for God. So it's that the emphasis is focused on the fact that God is perfect, not Adam, right? So that goes against the semi-divine connection that the Christians were making. And this goes against what the rabbis were saying. Now let's look at what the angel said. قالوا سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. They said, "Exalted are you. We have no knowledge except what you have taught us. Indeed, it is you who is the knowing, the wise." Look at that. So much emphasis on God. قال يا آدم أنبئهم بأسمائهم فلما أنبأهم بأسمائهم قال ألم أقل لكم إني أعلم غيب السماوات والأرض وأعلم ما تبدون وما كنتم تكتمون. He said, "O Adam, inform me of their names." And when he had informed them of their names, he said, "Did I not tell you that I know the unseen of the heavens and the earth, and I know what you reveal and what you have concealed." So again, the focus being on God. And so all that divinity from Adam is taken away, and the creativity of Adam is taken away, and the story is restructured to have an emphasis on God. And again, we see that the prostration, the Christians were saying the prostration is because Adam is divine in some way, but rather that's taken away, and the prostration is only because to show the honor that God has given mankind. Not that they're to be worshipped, not that they're being worshipped or anything in this way, right? Rather, it's just about the fact that God has exalted the human being above the status of the angel, right? And we see that when the prostration is mentioned, the focus is placed on the arrogance of Satan, not on the fact that, from the Christian tradition, they were looking at the fact that Adam was being bound to as him being divine. But when Satan doesn't prostrate to Adam in the story, God, in his response, mentions himself. Not that, "Oh, why didn't you prostrate to Adam? He is so worthy of prostration." Right? That he's the semi-divine figure. How dare you not prostrate to him? Right? But rather, the emphasis is put on himself. Why did you not prostrate to him, even though I commanded you? قَالَ مَا مَنَعَكَ أَلَّا تَسْجُدَ إِذْ أَمَرْتُكَ. Allah said, "What prevented you from prostrating when I commanded you?" قَالَ أَنَا خَيْرٌ مِّنْهُ خَلَقْتَنِي مِنْ نَارٍ وَخَلَقْتَهُ مِنْ طِينٍ. Satan said, "I am better than him. You created him from fire and you created me from fire and created him from clay." So it's about the arrogance of Satan here. And so similarly, we see here, قال يا إبليس ما منعك أن تسجد بما خلقت بيدي أستكبرت أم كنت من العالين. Allah said, "O Iblis, what prevented you from prostrating to what I created with my own hands? Did you just become proud, or have you always been arrogant?" So again, the focus on Satan being arrogant, and Satan not prostrating even though God created him with his own hands. And when you take this into account with "when I commanded you" and this and that, so it's clearly about Satan's arrogance to God, right? Not about Adam being divine in some way. Right, so focus on Allah's hand and arrogance, but in Christian version, it's that Adam is like Allah, right? And subhanallah, we say to that. right? And so if you notice, the hands of God were mentioned here as well, how he was created with his own hand. See if I can. Right, so God formed Adam with his holy hands, in his image, in his liking. And as the angels saw his glorious appearance, they were moved by the beauty of his likeness. So it's all about. So the hands are mentioned as a part of God, as part of Adam being divine in some way. But in the Quranic story, the hands are mentioned not for that reason, right? It's about God. It's about Satan being arrogant and defying God, right? And again, the theme of the angels praising God, the praises to God, not to Adam, right? We see in the setup to the story, the praise is all towards God, so that removes any misconception that the praise was and the worship was going to Adam. So angel worship is also interesting here because angel worship is refuted because the angels are prostrating. I don't know why I said worshiping there. So this is interesting because the Arabs used to worship angels. That was part of what they used to do. And so this story is also interesting because it refutes angel worship because it shows you that the human being had a higher status than that of the angels. Um, so that's an interesting interaction with the Arabs, what they used to believe. As you can see here, it's mentioned that they used to say the angels are the daughters of God. So that's, this story is very interesting because, first of all, it's dealing with the Jewish belief, right? Then it's dealing with the Christian belief, but it's also dealing with the Arabs and their worship of angels. So this actually ends up, the story ends up the way it plays out, ends up affirming monotheism a lot, even though at first someone might not understand why this story was included. But actually, when you keep the audience in mind, it's profound in the way it deals with three different groups through one story. And this story was revealed first in Mecca, or a lot of times in Mecca, and then also it was revealed here in Surah Al-Baqarah, which is in Medina. But this part about the angels, or about the naming of the angels, or sorry, Adam naming the different things, this is unique to Surah Baqarah, I think. It's not mentioned in the other versions, or at least the other versions are more about the prostration part. So it's interesting how that plays out. And again, the fact that the story was known even outside Medina, in Mecca, where no one knew about these stories, is very interesting. And again, it's interesting how this story is not in the Bible, right? It's not in the Bible. And all these different Judeo-Christian interpretations were talking about how the Jews and Christians were looking at this. We all know this because of what people in other lands were thinking. And so it's interesting how the Quran knows about those things and puts extra emphasis on that, right? If we go back to here, right, the emphasis on God's knowledge and God teaching Adam, right? This is all about God's knowledge, right? I know, about how the angels realize God is the one who is knowledgeable, and that's what this part of the story is about. So much focus is placed on that, and that makes sense when you think about the Jews were interacting. Why so much focus placed on this? You have to ask that question. Why? And it's clear when we take what the Jews in other lands were thinking about, why that's done, right? And also so much focus on God's praise. God praise. It occurs over and over again, which again is a great way to interact with what Christians in other lands were thinking. So clearly, the Quran author has intimate knowledge of these different traditions, and he's dealing with them in the Quran. Also, it's interesting that the fathers bowing to, or that the, you know, I'm gonna get to here the belief that the Arabs had, that they had a sort of almost a worship of their fathers is what they were doing, and that's interesting because that ties into Joseph's dream, because at the end of Joseph's dream, what is it about? It's about the parents prostrating to um, the parents prostrating to Joseph at the end, right? And the other brothers prostrate. but the Quran goes out of its way to mention that the parents prostrated to them, and then the brothers prostrating is implied because Joseph said, "This is the interpretation of my dream." And of course, the dream was that there were going to be 11 that there were the 11 brothers, and the two parents were going to prostrate all to Joseph, and that ends up happening. So when Joseph said, "This is the interpretation of my dream," of course, that tells you that the brothers have prostrated as well. But it's interesting that the Quran points out. وَرَفَعَ أَبَوَيْهِ عَلَى الْأَرْشِ وَخَرُّوا لَهُ سُجَّدًا. Then he raised his parents to the throne, and they all fell down in prostration to Joseph. So the emphasis on the parents. And that's very interesting because it plays, again, into the three different traditions. So it plays into the Arabs because the Arabs had almost this worshipping sort of deal with their forefathers, where they would, you know, for example, this verse demonstrates وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمْ تَعَالَوْا إِلَى مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ وَإِلَى الرَّسُولِ. And when it is said to them, "Come to Allah's revelation and to the messenger," قَالُوا حَسْبُنَا مَا وَجَدْنَا عَلَيْهِ آبَاءَنَا. They reply, sufficient is for us what we found our forefathers practicing. أَوَلَوْ كَانَ آبَاؤُهُمْ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ شَيْئًا وَلَا يَهْتَدُونَ. Would they still do so even if their forefathers had absolutely no knowledge or guidance? So that's very interesting that that's how they were looking at their forefathers, right? So even at Hajj, this is interesting that at Hajj, which is the pilgrimage, they used to mention the names of their fathers, their forefathers. And Allah mentions this in the Quran, interestingly. Let's see if I can pull it up for you. I know Surah Baqarah doesn't have 300 verses, by the way. So Allah says that when you're at Hajj, praise Allah as you used to praise your forefathers. Meaning because they would praise their forefathers in pilgrimage before Islam. So they had this sort of weird cult thing going on. And it's interesting when the emphasis is placed on the parents prostrating to Joseph, that teaches against this sort of forefather reverence that the Arabs had, right? So it's interesting how even that dream plays into the belief of the Arabs. And also the emphasis on the parents, both parents, the mother and father of Joseph prostrating to Joseph. That's interesting. And in fact, even before in the and we're going to get to this in a later episode. It's interesting that when Joseph's they arrive in the end to Egypt, it's mentioned how Joseph greets his parents, right? Both parents. Now, why is that interesting? Why is the emphasis being put on the parents? Because if you read before, the whole story is about Joseph and Jacob, right? His father. And suddenly, at the end of the story, فَلَمَا دَخَلُوا عَلَى يُوسُفَ آوَى إِلَيْهِ أَبَوَيْهِ. When they entered Joseph's presence, he received his parents, right? He took his parents to himself. Both are mentioned, which is interesting because his mother is not brought up beforehand, right? Before, it's all about Joseph. In fact, the story, Joseph is a character in the story, in the beginning of the story and throughout the story, but the mother is absent. But at the end, the mother is mentioned. And again, she's mentioned in the next verse. وَرَفَعَ أَبَوَيْهِ عَلَى الْأَرْشِ. And he raised his parents to the throne. Now, why is that interesting? Right? Along with it responding to the Arabs, it actually deals with a big problem in Judeo-Christian tradition, which is that in Genesis, the mother dies before the dream is fulfilled. And this ended up being a big problem for the rabbis. In fact, the rabbis came up with some really weird solutions to this. Like some of them suggested that Rachel, who was the mother, that she resurrected somehow to fulfill the dream, right? Because they saw, wow, this doesn't make any sense. Some of them said, well, maybe dreams can have only partial fulfillment, which again doesn't make sense because the whole point of dreams, especially, and they're a recurring theme in Genesis as well, is that they're prophetic revelation. Yet the revelation doesn't get fulfilled, which doesn't make any sense. And so it seems the emphasis on the parents coming and suddenly the mother being relevant at the end when the dreams are being when the fulfillment of the dream is happening. It's interesting because that seems to play in with the mother dying. So let's see if I can see. Rachel dies before dream is fulfilled? Because I know I didn't put a reference for that. Right, so how could Rachel fulfill Joseph's dream if she was dead, right? So you can see this is a big problem people brought up. Rachel was certainly dead, and this and that. So she died at Hebron. So Leah, who's the other wife of Joseph, Jacob does not even show up. And that's interesting when we go to the beginning of Genesis 37. I'm going to show you in a minute the beginning of Genesis 37. But here, I just want to show you before. So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath. So that shows you Rachel is dead, right? And the interesting thing when we go to Genesis 37 is when Joseph tells Jacob the dream, Jacob says, "Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" So it's an unfulfilled dream. It's unfulfilled revelation, and this ended up being a big problem for the rabbis, and so they had to come up with these creative solutions, which you could tell that they were struggling with the text, and they were coming up with these, really stretching and really grasping at straws, you would say, and coming up with some really desperate solutions. And so the Quran mention of the parents twice suddenly, right? Because you would expect, since the brothers aren't mentioned here, the brothers are just implied, you would expect it to only be about Joseph, right? The Jacob, the reunion between Jacob and Joseph. But yet the parents, both of them are mentioned, and they're mentioned twice, which means emphasis is being put on it. And it's interesting to see how that interacts with both Judeo-Christian tradition, because there was a problem for Christians and Jews, because it's in Genesis, but also the Arabs. That's the first example. The second example is the engagement with the story of Adam and Eve. So when we come to Genesis, the story of Adam and Eve has some problems. So, for example, Genesis 3:8 mentions, "Then the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and they hid from the Lord God among the trees of the garden." Genesis 2:9, "The Lord God made all kinds of trees grow out of the ground, trees that were pleasing to the eye and good for food. In the middle of the garden were the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil." Now, I'm going to get to why this is relevant in a section. But Genesis 3:8, we saw how God is walking in the garden, right? And they're hiding from God. Genesis 2:9 is the mention of the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Genesis 2:17, "But you must not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat from it, you will certainly not die." Right? So they were not allowed to eat from the tree of knowledge. Genesis 3:22-24. "And the Lord God said, the man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat, and live forever. So the Lord God banished him from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he had been taken. After he drove the man out, he placed on the east side of the Garden of Eden cherubim and a flaming sword flashing back and forth to guard the way to the tree of life." This is very interesting, because first of all, the Quran eliminates this idea that God was walking in the garden. And this is especially how Christians were looking at this, right? So some rabbis tried to get out of it and say that it means, no, the voice of God was hovering in this and that. So this was a text that the rabbis have, had a little bit of difficulty dealing with. But the Christians really took to this, right? Because, of course, they believe in a God-man. And the Quran, in its presentation, completely removes this. And not only that, but it removes this whole idea that God was scared that man was going to become like one of us, meaning the angels and God, right, knowing good and evil. Rather, the Quran interacts with this in a very interesting way, because it presents the exact opposite, that the whole point of man was that he would have the knowledge of good and evil. And in fact, the whole story of the prostration, the angels prostrating to Adam, which is not in Genesis, right, it's an extra Judeo-Christian tradition. It's interesting that the Quran mentions that, because that gets rid of this whole idea that God is scared or he's troubled that man will become like one of us, meaning God and the angels. Because in the Quran, Adam is given a rank higher than the angels. The angels are made to prostrate to him. So it's interesting how the Quran is interacting with these Genesis accounts, right? So when we go to this verse, for example, وَإِذْ أَخَذَ رَبُّكَ مِنْ بَنِي آدَمَ مِنْ زُهُورِهِمْ ذُرِّيَّتَهُمْ وَأَشْهَدَهُمْ عَلَى أَنفُسِهِمْ أَلَسْتُ بِرَبِّكُمْ قَالُوا بَلَى شَهِدْنَا أَنْ تَقُولُوا يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ إِنَّا كُنَّا عَنْ هَذَا غَافِلِينَ. And when your Lord brought from the loins of the children of Adam their descendants and had them testify regarding themselves, am I not your Lord? They replied, yes, you are. We testify. He cautioned, now you have no right to say on Judgment Day, we were not aware of this. So this whole idea of being aware of the knowledge of good and bad is ingrained in the Quranic depiction of Adam and humanity, that this is why they were created. And God placed this fitrah inside of them. And this is a big thing in the Quranic account, which is or in the Quran and the Hadith, which is this idea of the fitrah, which is this natural inclination. It's brought up in the Quran, it's brought up in the Hadith. And the idea is that people naturally know that there's one God, and also certain moral, ethical teachings and the knowledge of certain basic good and bad. This is part of the fitrah, and so that's how the Quran engages with this. And you can see how it's completely contradictory to what we find in Genesis, where in Genesis, he's got us scared, or he's worried that man will know good and evil, whereas in the Quran, that's an integral part of what humanity is from the beginning, and it's part of humanity's plan. Uh, and interestingly, also in the Quran, it's Satan who deceives them with these promises of the tree of immortality and kingdom. Right? It's not that there's anything special with the tree, which God is worried that they're gonna become like angels or something like that. But rather, this is how Satan is tricking them, right, into thinking these things, that they're gonna have kingdom or immortality. In this place, they say that you're gonna become like angels, which is ironic because of the because Adam is already given a higher rank, right? So there's an interesting bit of irony in the story there, or also how they're going to become immortals, right? So it's Satan tricking them, and this immortal part is interesting because that's in Genesis too. That we must not let them become immortal, which was mentioned here. All right. We must not. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever, right? So that's interesting because the Quran totally goes against this idea, and in fact, the Quran mentions how Satan was whispering to them, right? And then فَذَلَّهُمَا بِغُرُورٍ. So he brought them out from because of deception, right? Uh, so it's a completely different contrast to how the Quran is dealing with these Genesis stories, and in fact mentioning these things to go against this Genesis account. Also, we look at how the story is introduced in Surah Taha, and in the beginning, and in the verse before the story is introduced, it says, وَقُلْ رَبِّي زِدْنِي إِلْمًا, and say, my Lord, increase me in knowledge. So that's very interesting. That's mentioned, and then the story is given of Adam and all this business with the tree and not eating from the tree and this and that. So it's interesting that the phrase before that is increase me in knowledge, right? So that shows you again, knowledge is an integral part of a human being and who he is, and it's very important to God in the Quran, and that completely goes against the biblical account, which is where God doesn't want Adam to have knowledge of good and bad. So it's interesting that the way Allah sets this up, why is this here, right? Why is this verse just before this verse? Why is this mentioned right here, right? Very interesting, because it's completely opposite to the in its interaction with Genesis. And even if we go back to the setup in Surah Al-Baqarah, we go back to the last thing we mentioned, again, it's about God teaching Adam these things, and then Adam knowing more than the angels knew. So Adam knows these names, and the angels don't know these names. This is the setup for the story in chapter 2, right? Which again shows you that the emphasis on knowledge and human beings having knowledge and Adam having knowledge is in the Quran in chapter 2 when we look at the case study of chapter 2, and also when we look at chapter 20. Knowledge and it being essential is mentioned both times. And that completely goes against the Genesis account. So clearly there's an emphasis being placed on the importance of knowledge when it comes to the story of Adam, and it's interesting to contrast that and see how it interacts with the Genesis account. Okay, so the author of the Quran seems to be aware of how the story plays out in Genesis and is correcting it, giving its own perspective. And again, we talked about how uh, God, or how I don't know why I put this here actually. Wait, I don't know why I put this here. Oh, maybe I put it here because I just wanted to mention how the reason Satan didn't prostrate was because he was from the jinn, not from the angels. But rather, he was brought up to the company of the angels because he was so pious. Right, and so also I want to mention that there is a emphasis in the Quran about the amana, which is that the before the heavens and the earth were, or not before the heavens and the earth, but that God, he gave something called the amana. He offered it to the heavens and the earth and the mountains. There's a verse in the Quran, and they could not bear it. So then he offered it to mankind, or to Adam, and he bore it, right? Uh, and I guess maybe I was trying to put that verse on, but that's an interesting contrast too, because this is mentioned at the end of chapter 33. Uh, and so, what was the amana? As Ibn Kathir explains, what Ibn Abbas said, that it means obedience. This was offered to them before, meaning the heavens of the earth and this and that, and the mountains, before it was offered to Adam, and they could not bear it. And Allah said to Adam, I've offered the amana to the heavens and the earth and the mountains, and they could not bear it. Will you take it on? He said, O Lord, what does it involve? He said, if you do good, you will be rewarded, and if you do evil, you will be punished. So Adam took the amana and bore it, and this is what is referred to in the ayah, وَحَمَلَهَا الْإِنسَانُ إِنَّهُ كَانَ ظَلُومًا جَهُولًا. But man bore it. Verily, he was unjust and ignorant. So that's interesting because, again, that shows you that knowledge of good and bad, knowledge of good and evil, is integral in the Quranic account, whereas it's something which God doesn't want Adam to know. It was not in God's plan, or God's plan, I use that liberally, for Adam to know, and God is angry that Adam now has the knowledge of good and evil, right? And again, how we mentioned before, how these are actual things that God doesn't seem to want to happen. Uh, that Adam would become immortal and know good and evil, whereas in the Quran, it's a lot of these ideas are contrasted, and it's actually Satan who's deceiving them and tricking them into these things, and they're not actually true. So that's the second thing. I wanted to show you a couple of examples of stories in the Quran and how they differ from the biblical account, and how Christians and Jews were reading these texts, and how the Quran seems to be interacting with Genesis in that second story, for example, and certainly was interacting with how the Judeo-Christian interpretations of the name story, right? The story of how Adam named these things in the prostration. The next thing I want to move on to is a direct reference, which is Aaron not making the calf. So if you read Exodus, it's mentioned how Aaron made the calf, right? So the golden calf is made by Aaron. So that's very interesting, and of course, there is a Talmud. It is mentioned in the Talmud how this Aaron did this accidentally and this and that. But certainly Christians were looking at this and taking it, and to this day they look at it and they take the literal word, because when you read the literal word, it's clear that Aaron made the calf, right? So he says, for example, he took what they handed him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Right? That's very interesting, because at the end, Aaron seems to pretend to Moses that he just put it in the fire and this calf came out, whereas when you read this verse, it's clear that Aaron actually made it, and he even fashioned it with a tool. Right? So Christians read this, and I mean, obviously when you're going to read the literal interpretation, it's at Aaron making the calf. right? And a lot of times, actually, the Talmudic rabbis will try and cover up for prophets, which is interesting. For example, Solomon not disbelieving, or Solomon disbelieving at the end and worshiping idols, and the Talmud says, no, that didn't happen. It was just metaphorical, or it wasn't as bad as that, and that David didn't commit adultery and this and that, which is clear things mentioned in the Bible, and the Talmudic rabbis try and cover it up and change it. Uh, so a lot of times it will change the literal meaning of these verses. But certainly you can see how in Exodus, Aaron is blamed for making the calf. And the Quran, interestingly, takes some extra time in Surah Taha to mention how Aaron was not responsible for the calf. So when you look at this story, the story mentioned here in Surah Taha, it's interesting because I put it out of order, but this is what it says, right? So, and what made you hasten from your people, O Moses? He said, they're close upon my tracks, and I hasten to you, my Lord, that you may be pleased. He said, but indeed we have tried your people after you, and the Samari has led them astray. These are really good verses in Arabic, unfortunately. I should have read them. Let's see where 86 is. Did I include 86? All right, okay. So Moses returned to his people angry and grieved. He said, O my people, did your Lord not make you a good promise? Then was the time too long for you, or did you wish that wrath from your Lord descend upon you, so you broke your promise to me? They said, we did not break our promise to you by our will, but we were made to carry burdens from the ornaments of the people, so we throw them, and thus did the samurai throw. And he extracted for them a calf which had a lowing sound, and they said, this is your God and the God of Moses. Did they not see that it could not return to them any speech, and that it did not possess for them any harm or benefit? So it's mentioned how Samari was the one who made the calf. And then interestingly, it says, وَلَقَدْ قَالَ لَهُمْ هَارُونُ مِنْ قَبْلُ يَا قَوْمِ إِنَّمَا فُتِنْتُمْ بِهِ وَإِنَّ رَبَّكُمُ الرَّحْمَنُ فَاتَّبِعُونِي وَأَطِيعُوا أَمْرِي. And Aaron had already told them before, O my people, you are only being tested by it, and indeed your Lord is the most merciful, so follow me and obey my order. Right? And then the story continues. Or actually, the response is mentioned, then the story continues. They said, we will never cease being devoted to it until Moses returns. And then the story continues. Why is this here? Why is this extra detail here? Right? It's not actually in the Exodus account. The Quran seems to be summarizing the Exodus account pretty well, uh, except for this extra part here. Why is this here? Why did the narrator, right? Allah is acting as a narrator here, or he is narrating here. He adds this extra part. Why is it here? It's very interesting. And again, it's a divergence from how Exodus tells the story. And it seems to be putting the emphasis on how Aaron was not responsible for the calf, right? So that's very interesting that the Quran is aware of the accusation against Aaron, and it takes a couple of verses out to clear him of the accusation that he made the calf. Right? And so this is actually in the Exodus account where Moses confronting Aaron. That's where the Exodus account picks up on, right? And that's also mentioned here when the story is told in chapter 7. It's the same thing. It's a very similar story, and then that interaction where Moses interacting with Aaron is mentioned. But in the Exodus account, again, it seems like Aaron is, so guilty, so he's trying to jumble things up and not telling Moses the whole truth. Because he seems to be contradicting what he was saying beforehand, where it's clear that Aaron made the calf beforehand, and then Aaron tries to get out of it in the Exodus account, right? And so the Quran, if it were just to mention Aaron's response here, you would still maybe think, based on the Exodus account, that Aaron did have something to do with it. He was just trying to clear his name in front of Moses. But that's why the Quran seems to have these extra verses to make clear, in case Aaron's words aren't enough because of how they're mentioned in the Exodus account. It's clear, that's why the Quran seems to go out of his way. And Aaron had already told them beforehand, this and that, right? So clearly clearing his name. And that's very interesting. In fact, let me see if I can put on the Exodus account. Exodus, Aaron. Oh, it's Exodus 3, right? I think it's Exodus 3. Because I do, or, no, it's not Exodus 3, because I thought, okay, it's Exodus 32, because I remember the 3 here. But I just want to show you Aaron's dialogue, right? Because we read that verse where Aaron made the calf and then he fashioned it with a tool. Right? They handed him and he made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf and fashioned it with a tool. And so it's clear Aaron is responsible. But then when Moses talks to him, uh, he says, do not be angry, my lord. Aaron answered, you know how prone these people are to evil. They said to me, make us gods who will be before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him. So I told them, whoever has any gold jewelry, take it off. Then they gave me the gold and I threw it into the fire and out came this calf, right? So he's leaving out the details about how he made the calf and he fashioned it with a tool, right? He made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. So he's almost telling a half-truth, right? He's omitting these very important details. And so that's why the Quran knows that just by presenting the story of Aaron clearing his name in front of Moses isn't enough. But the narrator goes out of his way to mention that Aaron had already told them beforehand this is what's happened. So it's a very interesting way to clear the name of Aaron. Number 4, the lineage of Jesus. So in Numbers 1, we see that it's mentioned that, and by the way, so according to Numbers 1, when we see that the lineage is being traced by the fathers, right? So according to that, in a way, you're being traced to your tribes based on your father. Right? That's how Numbers 1 presents the account. So see if I can show you. So take ye the number of all the congregation of the children of Israel by their families, by the house of their fathers. So the census is taken by their fathers. So it's mentioned the sons of these fathers and this and that, right? And so again, it's here mentioned they declare their pedigrees according to their families by the house of their fathers, right? And here again, the word is their fathers. Fathers, fathers, fathers. Ibn Ezra comments on this, Jewish commentator, to the home of their fathers. Why is the father mentioned? He says because the mother's family is not referred to, the mother's family is not, in this context, referred to as family. So you can see how Jews, in this, when it comes to ascribing lineage, based on which tribe you're from, are interested in the fathers, right? Of course, they do have that place where it's about your Jewish identity is dependent on your mother's, but when it comes to tracing your lineage, it's about the fathers, which is what Numbers 1 is painting. Interestingly, the Quran picks up on this when it speaks about Moses and Jesus in these verses. وَإِذْ قَالَ مُوسَى لِقَوْمِهِ يَا قَوْمِ. And when Moses said to his people, "O my people," right? And then the verse continues. But interestingly, the next verse says, وَإِذْ قَالَ عِيسَى ابْنُ مَرْيَمَ يَا بَنِي إِسْرَائِيلَ. And when Jesus, the son of Mary, said, "O children of Israel." So, لِقَوْمِ, to his people, is omitted, and he doesn't say, "O my people." He says, "Ya bani Israel," "O the children of Israel." So that's very interesting because Jesus did not have a father. So that's very precise language in the Quran. It's sort of picking up on that Jewish theme of ascribing lineage through your father. Well, Jesus didn't have a father, right? So that's a very interesting dynamic how the Quran is playing with Jewish tradition. And of course, Jesus was an Israelite, right? Right, but the language and reference is interesting and derivative of how Jews looked at how you trace your lineage to the tribes traditionally. Some people will say, well, if you're going by that, Jews will say that that means that Jesus could not be the Messiah because he was not the son of David or whatever. But again, he was technically an Israelite. It's just a nice play on how Jews were looking at lineage. And so yes, he would still technically be the son of David. But even then, it's interesting because in Matthew 22, Jesus clearly denies that he's the son of David, right? As biblical scholars like E.P. Sanders point out here, saying, "What think ye of Christ? Whose son is he?" They said unto him, "The son of David." He said unto them, "How then doth David in spirit call him Lord, saying, The Lord said unto my Lord, Sit thou on my right hand." So Jesus is saying, if the Messiah is the son of David in Matthew, why does David call him Lord? Right, and it's interesting because there are many different messiahs in Judaism. Even there's a Messiah Joseph, and what is a prophecy of the Messiah and what is not. Ultimately, the Bible doesn't tell you this one is about the Messiah, so it's all about interpretation. And so I don't think there's any prophecy which you have to take as being about the Messiah from David. Right. The next thing I want to mention is the die of God. Now this is very interesting because in the context of a discussion to Jews and Christians, the Quran says, first of all, it says, it mentions how the Jews and Christians say, be Jews or Christians, you'll be guided. You'll be guided. Rather, the religion of Abraham, inclining toward truth, and he was not of the monotheists. Then it's mentioned, say, we believe in God, and basically what's been revealed to us, and then the revelations from beforehand and the prophets before. And then the next verse says, so if they believe like you, they're guided. I think that's what the verse is. And then it says, the next verse after that is صبغة الله ومن أحسن من الله صبغة ونحن له عابدون. The die of God, and who is better in dying than God, right? And to him we are slaves, worshippers. So this imagery and language of the die of God, that our die is the die of God, is very interesting in the Quran, and I don't think it's mentioned elsewhere. Yet it's mentioned here and in this discussion with Jews and Christians. And interestingly, this picks up on a Christian theme, a Syriac Christian theme. I believe it's not Syriac, but it's in the Gospel of Philip, which was an extra gospel, a non-canonical gospel. So again, it's about extra biblical Christian material being dealt with here, where the term die of God is used as a metaphorical allusion to baptism. So in the Gospel of Philip, it says, God is the dyer. Like the good dyes, they are called the true dyes. Die with those that have been dyed in them. Thus it is with those whom God has dyed. Since his dyes are immortal, they become immortal by means of his remedies. But God dips/baptizes those whom he dips/baptizes in water. So baptism, the water, is being signified here as the die of God. Whereas in the Quran, there's almost a response that rather our die is the die of God, as in his religion. That's the real die of God. Interestingly, there's a verse before too, where they say, where God tells us to say to the Jews and Christians that true guidance is the guidance of God, right? So a lot of these ideas are being refuted in chapter 2. A lot of the claims of the Jews and Christians, and interestingly, that this verse, that the die of God, is almost a response to the Christians who talk about baptism, that the Christians baptize. Well, God is saying, no, this religion, this is the die of God, right? And who is better in dying than God? Right? It's not about getting dyed by water, and it's not that the baptism is the die of God, but rather we are the die of God. That's interesting. And even Al-Razi makes this connection too. I don't think he's from Ahl Sunnah though, so I don't really care what he says. But it's interesting that he made this connection too. And so here's the person who pointed this out was Sean Anthony. He says, for anyone familiar with the Quranic Sibghat Allah, which is what we just read, the designation of God as a dyer in Gospel of Philip is immediately striking, as both are framed satirical. I don't know what that word means. But again, the idea that the Quran is interacting with these extra biblical traditions and has knowledge of them. And it's interesting, again, that this is mentioned in a discussion to Jews and Christians, right? That's even the context. Right? So it's this was not mentioned elsewhere, but it was mentioned in the discussion with Jews and Christians. And especially in responding back to a lot of what Jews and Christians say. So it's almost like, for example, when the Quran uses this phraseology that Noah says to his people, if you mock us, then we will mock you like you mock at us, right? So a lot of times, for example, it's mentioned that the hypocrites think to deceive God, but God deceives them, right? And this and that. But God deceives them. What that means is like, it's that phraseology is being used, that they're thinking that they know what God doesn't know, and they're trying to trick him and this and that. But actually, it's God who's dealing with them in that way, because they end up thinking that they're going to be in paradise, but they're actually not, right? Because they think they're tricking God, uh, because they don't believe on the inside, uh, but in reality they're gonna end up in hell, right? So innal munafiqina yukhadi'una Allah wa huwa khadi'uhum. Surely the hypocrites seek to deceive Allah, but He outwits them, right? That's the meaning. The hypocrites deceive Allah, but think to deceive Allah, but He is deceiving them, right? So this, claim made and then God saying the same thing in reverse back is actually a theme in the Quran, and it seems to be what is being said here. So again, the Quran picking up on this tradition. The next thing I want to talk about is the Exodus account and how the Quran deals with the Exodus account, the biblical account of Moses, and it deals with it a lot of times in the light of contradictions and problems in the Bible, but also from a perspective of Egyptian history. So it's very interesting to think about these things. The first thing which is interesting is how the Quran deals with uh, uh, the Egyptian belief, and this isn't really related to the biblical Exodus account, but it's interesting. I'm going to show you the verse, and then I'm going to show you what I'm talking about. But there's a Quranic verse which speaking about Pharaoh being drowned in this and that. It says, فَمَا بَكَتْ عَلَيْهِمُ السَّمَاءُ وَالْأَرْضُ وَمَا كَانُوا مُنْزَرِينَ. And the heaven and earth wept not for them, nor were they reprived. Now, why is this in there? Why is this? Okay, why is God mentioning that after the Pharaoh was drowned and his army was drowned, the heaven and earth were not weeping for them? Right? Why is that there? It's interesting because this seems to interact with a Egyptian belief that after the Pharaoh died, uh, and he would be ascending to heaven, and they would say things like, here in the hieroglyphs, it's mentioned, the sky weeps for you, the earth quakes at you, the morning woman calls to you, great pouring post cries out to you, your feet stamp, your arms wave, and you ascend to the sky as a star, as the morning star. And interestingly, the Quran even talks about this idea where the Pharaoh tells Haman that, build for me a tower so I can go look at the God of Moses. So this idea of ascending is also referenced in the Quran. Right? So in another Pyramic text, the sky weeps, the stars shake, the keepers of the gods tremble, and their servants flee. Right? Talking about a Pyramic text describing the dead pharaohs fight for supremacy in heaven. Right? And so Allah seems to be picking up on this. This is where I put it. Anyway. So Allah seems to be picking up on this and refuting this idea. فَمَا بَكَتْ عَلَيْهِمُ السَّمَاءُ وَالْأَرْضُ وَمَا كَانُوا مُنْزَرِينَ. The heaven and earth wept not for them, nor were they reprieved. So the Quran interacting with these ancient hieroglyphs and these ancient Egyptian beliefs is very interesting too. Right? And again, this stuff was not known at the time. Following the Roman invasion of Egypt in the 30 BC, the use of hieroglyphics began to die out. In fact, by the 5th century, it was totally gone. And it was only with the discovery of the Rosetta Stone in the 1800s that we now know what the Egyptian hieroglyphics said. So how did the author of the Quran know this? Also, there's an engagement with the Exodus account, right? So going more on that theme. There's a big contradiction and a big problem in the Bible, because in the Bible the Israelites are mentioned as a big group. It's mentioned that in the Exodus there were 600,000 men on foot besides women and children. But there would be like at least a couple million Israelites, right? When you take women and children into account. This is a big problem in the biblical account because it doesn't make sense, because Pharaoh appoints 2 midwives to kill all the children. That doesn't make sense. If there are 2 million people and there's so many babies, it doesn't really make sense that only 2 midwives be able to take care of these so many babies. Also, in Exodus, God says when they're approaching the Holy Land that I will not drive them out in a single year, because the land would become desolate and the wild animals too numerous for you. Little by little I will drive them out before you until you have increased enough to take possession of the land. It doesn't make sense if it was a nation of 2 million people that, it doesn't seem like the wild animals devouring them would be a concern. Right? So it seems to go against the biblical account. And it doesn't make any sense because from Moses to Aaron there were only 4 generations, yet or sorry, Joseph to Moses, there are only 4 generations according to the Bible. Yet somehow Joseph and his brothers, who were 12, and then maybe they had a few children at the time, how did they end up becoming 2 million people in 4 generations? Doesn't make sense. It's actually a big problem in the Bible. So according to these people, there's 64 years between Moses. According to these people, they're like 100 or something. I don't know. Whatever they give as a date, it's not big enough. In fact, in Deuteronomy 7, they're called the fewest of people, the fewest of all nations. Right? The Lord did not set his affection on you and chose you because you were more numerous than other peoples, for you were the fewest of all peoples. Interestingly, a nation of 2 million at that point would actually be a very large nation. And so the Quran uh, interacts with this big problem in the Bible very interestingly. And there's this verse here where it says, فَأَرْسَلَ فِرْعَوْنُ فِي الْمَدَائِنِ هَاشِرِينَ. Then Pharaoh sent among the cities gatherers. إِنَّ هَؤُلَاءِ لَشِرْذِمَةٌ قَلِيلُونَ. And said, indeed, those are but a small band. Why is this in here? The mention of a small band. Yes, it fits into the story where uh, Pharaoh is, exalted himself on the earth, and he's being arrogant and seeing himself as such a high and mighty and this and that. But it's also interesting because it's clearly dealing with the big problem and contradiction in the Bible. Right? So it seems like the author of the Quran is aware of this, a big issue in the Bible, and he's correcting it. Also, another thing is the mention of king versus Pharaoh. So Joseph is dated as by scholars. The story of Joseph, it is dated at the Middle Kingdom period. Story of Moses is dated New Kingdom period, right? And this is you can find this out, because through some basic ideas, and also when you look at the fact that the Israelite story must have happened before 1200 CE, because there's a mention of, or 1200 BC, because there's a mention of the Israelites in 1200 BC and this and that. And so anyway, when you look at all these things, the story of Joseph is dated to the Middle Kingdom period, and the story of Moses is dated to the New Kingdom period, because Egyptian history is divided up into these different periods. So the story of Moses is mentioned at the Middle Kingdom, and the story of Moses is dated to the New Kingdom. It's very interesting also because another thing I just wanted to point out, because in the Middle Kingdom period, there's the inscription of Jacob. There's an inscription called Yaqub, which again is very interesting, and Yaqub as being one of the high city officials. So that's a Semitic name, right? So that shows you, that's perhaps indicative of the fact that the Israelites were there at that time, not that they came later on in the New Kingdom period. So interestingly, the Quran calls the Pharaoh, or the Bible calls the Pharaoh at the time of Abraham, Joseph, and Moses Pharaoh, right? But the Quran calls at the time of Joseph king, and at the time of Moses Pharaoh. And also when you look at Abraham, when you look at 1200 BC, and the New Kingdom starts around 1500, and then there's a mention of the Israelites in Egypt at 1200 BC, so that's 300 years. Now there are like a lot more years between Abraham and Moses than 300 years. So that again shows you that the story of Moses could not be, or that Abraham and Moses could not both be in the New Kingdom period. Abraham had to be before. Yet at the time, the story of Abraham, the leader of Egypt is called Pharaoh, but in the Quran, in the story of Joseph, he's called king. So there's this distinction made. Interestingly, now we know, and you can see the references on the screen, that in the New Kingdom period, which is when Moses' story was happening, that's when the title Pharaoh was first used for the leader of Egypt. Before that, it just meant to represent the house. So this is a big historical mistake in the Bible, that it calls in Abraham's time, in Joseph's time, the leader of Egypt, Pharaoh. But the Quran got it right. It referred to him as king, which is one of the things that the leader was called at the time. Right. So Pharaoh, originally the royal palace in ancient Egypt, the word came to be used metonymically for the Egyptian king under the New Kingdom from the 1839 to 1292 BC and by the 22nd dynasty, and it had been adopted as an epithet of respect. So again, you can see only around like is that less than 300 years where this dynasty is dated. So it shows you Abraham and Moses could not be in the same time. They're like at least 400 years according to the Bible. Prophecy between them. The Bible itself says that, right? So again, some more proofs that, and you can read the references that it was at the start of the New Kingdom that the word Pharaoh started being used. Before that, king was used, or different titles and this and that. So the Quran got it historically right, and the Bible got it wrong. So it's interesting that the Quran is sort of correcting the biblical accounts from a perspective of ancient lost Egyptian history, and there's no way Muhammad could have known these things. Peace be upon him. And if he was copying from the Bible, he would have copied this Pharaoh part as well. Why change it to king? Also, the age of Moses is a big problem in the Bible too, from a historical point of view. Right? So I'm showing you multiple examples which shows you the Quran is clearly aware of these problems in the Exodus account, in the biblical accounts, from both a contradiction within the book, but also from the perspective of Egyptian history, and it goes out of its way to correct these things. Right? So that's very interesting because these multiple examples show you that clearly the Quran is going out of its way. So, or at least correcting from the perspective of Egyptian history and biblical contradictions and this and that. So, the age of Moses, if you read Surah Al-Qasas, so here I just have that, it's mentioned in Surah Al-Qasas that if you read through the story, actually, I don't need this stuff, but when you read through the story, it's mentioned that there's a... Okay, so Moses is born, he's a baby, and then there's a transition to him reaching adulthood. And then after that, the events seem to happen very quick. Right? He then kills the man, then he flees to Midian, then he stays there for 8 or 10 years, and then he is called at the burning bush. So after he reaches maturity, all of it happens pretty quick. Right? And then there's this gap of 8 to 10 years where he's working for the father of his wife. Right? So, as God mentions, فَلَمَّا قَضَى مُوسَى الْأَجَلَ and when Moses had completed the term and was traveling with his family, he proceeded from the direction of the Mount of Fire, and then the God calling out to Moses happens. So it happens quickly. Right? And so when he reaches adulthood, and then all this happens. So there's this flow and this quickness. Now, interestingly, in the Exodus account, Moses and Aaron are actually 80 and 83 years old when God speaks to them in the bush, right? And when they speak to Pharaoh. So that's a lot later on than the Quranic account. In the Quranic picture, it's happening a lot sooner than that, right? That's interesting because from a historical point of view, the Bible story makes no sense. And it's in fact wrong. So, first thing, again, we know because of this inscription of the Israelites and the Canaan, the land of Canaan, Israelite and being mentioned at the time Canaan. So this is what the inscription says. Israel is mentioned, right? So we know the Exodus account must have happened before this date, because how else can you have this Israel description? Now, according to the Bible, there were two pharaohs. First, there was a pharaoh at the time of Moses, and then when he killed the man and this and that. But then after, when Moses fled from Pharaoh and goes to live in Midian, there's a different pharaoh, right? So the king of Egypt dies, right? So king of Egypt, called with the title of Pharaoh, right? King of Egypt is the description, the title is Pharaoh. He dies, and then there's a new pharaoh. So in these 80 years, when he's born, and then the burning bush incident, there are 80 years, and there are two pharaohs. Interestingly, when we line it up with biblical history, or with the history of Egyptian rulers, it doesn't make sense. We look at any two ancient Egyptian pharaohs in the New Kingdom period. Again, we know it's New Kingdom because he's being called Pharaoh, right? Which was not used until the New Kingdom. We see none of them line up to 80 years. In fact, the highest you can get is 77 years, right? And so the biblical account, which says there were 80 years from Moses' birth to when he spoke to Pharaoh, and there are only supposed to be two pharaohs in there, and yet historically that's wrong. I have another source for that here too. That was just a good graphic, so I put that here, and then here's another source for that. You can just pause that and read that. So the biblical story has another contradiction. The Quran fixes this, and it only depicts one pharaoh, first of all, and again, the events seem to go by a lot quicker. Right, so we can see in the beginning of Surah Al-Qasas, which is when the baby and that happens. So God mentions the Pharaoh, and then the same Pharaoh, and how he's going to, cause the Israelites to be unoppressed and inherit Jerusalem and this and that. And then at the end, when it happens, you see it's the same Pharaoh and it's the same Haman. So it's the same characters being brought through, and everything is happening a lot quicker. And so maybe there were 40 years or which between the events, and that would line up perfectly with Ramesses the second, and there could be 38 years or this or that between the events. But either way you look at it, certainly, and it seems again Moses was like a middle-aged. It certainly lines up with Ramesses the second. So the Quranic account, which depicts one pharaoh, is historically accurate. And of course, Ramesses the second is significant because he's, most people have concluded that he was the pharaoh of Moses' Exodus, right? When you look at most scholars, they say, yeah, it was Ramesses the second, and the Quranic account perfectly fixed Ramesses the second because he had the 66-year reign, whereas the Exodus account doesn't, and the Quran corrects this. It's interesting that the Quran will a lot of times repeats the story of Moses, but here it's repeated again. And now the interesting about Surah Al-Qasas is his childhood, and then the story at Midian is given a lot of importance. But after that, the Quran then goes out of its way to repeat the burning bush incident and then the Pharaoh thing, and that happens in 10 verses where he goes to Pharaoh and then the Pharaoh is drowned. It's presented as a linear narrative again, and even though the focus is on this new stuff that isn't really given much attention beforehand, it's interesting that the Quran will lay out this whole narrative from his birth to the death of Pharaoh and repeat that part about the going to the Pharaoh and talking to him and the burning bush incident. So it's one linear narrative, and you can see from that that this stuff is clearly not happening over 80 years, but a lot less than that. So maybe one reason the Quran strings together that narrative and again repeats him going to Pharaoh and the Pharaoh drowning is so that you can see that the Quran is clearly not depicting an 80-year-old Moses, which would be historically inaccurate. So the Quran correcting the Bible again. And these are different examples than some of what we saw last time, but I thought it was interesting to go through the Exodus account. Yeah, okay. We're gonna have another video series in this video, or another video in this series, which will be a little bit different too. Now, point 10 is the Quran correcting the name of God. Again, this is dealing with a big contradiction, a big problem in the Bible account, because in the Bible account, God speaks to Moses and he says, "I am." The name of God in Judeo-Christian tradition. I'm not gonna say it because I want Jews to watch my videos, and you can see here the four-letter name. So God spoke to Moses and said to him, "I am that name. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty, but by my name, the four-letter name, I was not known to them." So according to Exodus, this name is a special revelation to Moses and the children of Israel, and Abraham and the patriarchs did not know it. But interestingly, when we go to Genesis 15, Abraham knows the name. God says to him, Abraham says to him, God says to Abraham, "I am that name," and then Abraham says to him, Abraham says the name too. So clearly, Abraham knows the name. So he says, "Lord," and that name. How will I know what I will inherit? So clearly, Abraham knows the name. Yet in Exodus, it's a special name that Abraham did not know, and Isaac did not know, and Jacob did not know. In fact, Isaac and Jacob know the name too. Here in Genesis 27, they know the name. Isaac uses the name, right? So that's a big problem in the biblical account. There's this big contradiction, and we saw a contradiction before too with the small groups, and then we saw a contradiction with Egyptian history. And I showed you the sky weeping example to show you that the Quran has intimate knowledge of these, of even this obscure, you know, Egyptian belief of the past, and how it engages with it, and how the Quran is engaging with the Exodus contradictions, but also from the historical point of view. And it's interesting that there's this big contradiction in the Bible too, and the Quran corrects it, and it corrects that the name of God was Allah, not that four-letter name. Right? So we see at the burning bush, God says to Moses, "Ya Musa, Ya Musa, inni ana Allahu Rabbul Alameen." O Moses, indeed I am Allah, Lord of the worlds. Right? And even Moses in chapter 5 used the name, Ya qawm iskuru ni'matallahi alaykum. O my people, remember the favor of Allah upon you. Right? And the name that the Jewish prophets use in the Quran is Allah, not that four-letter name. Right? And that seems to be correcting this big problem we have in the Bible, which is that this is supposed to be the name of God that was especially given to Moses, yet the patriarchs and Abraham knew this beforehand as well. Right? It's interesting also that Jesus never used that name, and John the Baptist never used that name, and Zechariah never used that name when speaking about God. Right? It's only found in the Hebrew Bible, and the Hebrew Bible clearly has this big problem. And also we have problems of this is supposed to be a special revelation to Moses, yet we have inscriptions of the name beforehand, before Moses, and this and that, which again shows you that, you know, this is something that the name of God that was lost by the Jews and then made up and changed clearly could not have been revealed by God, because otherwise there couldn't be this big contradiction. And the Quran goes out of its way to say, Inni anallah, indeed I am God. So there's Inni anallah, indeed I am God, or Allah, right? So that word is used, and that clears up a big problem in the Exodus account as well in the Bible. So again, we see the Quran correcting the Bible, and even the name of God in Judeo-Christian tradition, how it's pronounced, no one really knows what even means. Really, I mean, depending on how the vowels would be and how it's pronounced, that could change the meaning, right? And it could be a proper name with a different meaning that's not related to the actual language. If it's like a proper name of God being revealed, right? That doesn't need to have any relation to linguistics. So, I'm going to summarize the examples we talked about, and then I'll make my argument, or I'm going to go over a little bit of the argument I was making. So, the examples I brought up were in this section was how the Quran has intimate knowledge of how Judeo-Christian tradition was dealing with the prostration to Adam story in different lands, right? So again, this was not in Arabia. We don't have any evidence of this in Arabia, and I guess there were no Christians in Arabia at the time. Right? There were just Jewish communities. Yet the Talmudic rabbis and the Christians are dealing with this text in a very interesting way, right? And they had certain interpretations, and the Quran goes out of its way and puts emphasis on refuting these sorts of notions. We saw the example of how it even interacts with the Arab angel worship. We saw the Joseph dream, how the Quran puts emphasis on the fact that the mother was there too when she prostrated to Joseph, which goes against the which corrects a big problem in the biblical account. So again, we see a lot of correction of the Bible account happening. So many contradictions are mentioned, and a lot of time here, for example, emphasis is put on the contradiction being solved, which again shows you that the Quran knows about these problems and is solving them. We saw, well, I also mentioned how it interacts with the Arab belief of almost exonerating the forefathers to worship level. We saw about how the Quran engages with the Adam and Eve storyline, takes away a lot of the problematic aspects, like God not wanting Adam and Eve to, or mankind to know about good and bad, and then this and that, and walking in the garden, and you know, being sort of apprehensive in this and that. All that is taken out. And rather it's all these problems are actually, the knowledge and this and that, and that the people should have knowledge and that they should know about good and bad. This is actually flipped, and it's a big part of the Quranic account, right? We also saw Aaron not making the calf being a big thing in the Quran and being emphasized, which goes against Judeo-Christian tradition. We saw the lineage of Jesus. That's a very interesting mention, how the Quran made that distinction. We also saw the die of God and how that echoes the Gospel of Philip, like a lost gospel, which some Christians believed in the past. We saw the sky did not weep and the earth did not weep, and how that interacts with this the classic Judeo-Christian, or not Judeo, but this Egyptian belief that after the Pharaoh died, the sky would be weeping for him and this and that, and the earth too. Mentioned the Quran again, fixing the contradiction and the big problem about the Israelites being 2 million people. We saw the Quran correcting the idea that at Joseph and Abraham's time, the leader was a pharaoh, when it was actually called a king. Saw the age of Moses, right? The whole narrative of Surah Al-Qasas presents it much quicker, right? Correcting a big biblical problem. Right? And again, correcting it from a historical standpoint. Right? How would Muhammad know about these historical things? Peace be upon him. And again, we saw the contradiction and the big problem about the name of God in Judeo-Christian tradition, and how that makes no sense, and God correcting that in the Quran as well. Right? In fact, if we go to here, where the same story is given, I think it's also mentioned that God again says to Moses, "I am Allah," in chapter 20 when the story is given. No, actually, all right, okay. Inni an Allah. Indeed, I am Allah. It is truly I am Allah. So here, emphasis is being put on Inni an Allah. Right, right. It's mentioned twice that indeed I truly am Allah. Right. Indeed, I am Allah. It is truly I am Allah. That is why the translators are translating it like that. So emphasis is being put on the fact that He's Allah, not the four-letter name, but Allah. Now, again, the technical stance from an Islamic point of view is that that could be a name of God that was revealed to Jews and Christians, but not revealed to us. That's possible. But certainly, the way the Quranic picture at least gets rid of that big contradiction, right? That big problem and contradiction in the Christian account and Jewish account is taken care of, right? So, why is emphasis? My thing here is, why is emphasis being put inni an Allah, right? Twice it's repeated, and I think we saw that here too. Inni an Allah, right? So emphasis being put on the fact that He is Allah, right? So maybe it's or it seems to be a lot. Of course it fits into the story, but it's also a nice way to interact with that idea that when Moses said to God at the burning bush, well, when the Israelites ask me about you, what should I say? And then he, in the biblical account, he supposedly gives him the name, the four-letter name of God. That's what he says. God says, "I am," and then he says that name, right? So that in the biblical account, that's the name that God says to Moses. But in the Quranic account, it's Allah, right? And so, yes, well, again, that four-letter name could have been something that was revealed to Jews and Christians, because we do know, from an Islamic point of view, there are some names that were revealed to other people that were not revealed to us, other nations. They were not revealed to us because we have the hadith where the Prophet says, "I ask you by any name, all your names, whether you revealed it to a slave of yours on the earth," and this and that, which indicates perhaps there were other names that were revealed to others. Right, and we know there are other names of God in the unseen and this and that. But at least from this point of view, from this account, the Quran is correcting this big issue in the biblical account. If it's not completely refuting the idea that that is the name of God. So again, what this shows me, I think, is the Quran has intimate knowledge of these Hebrew, Greek, Syriac texts. Right? Again, remember how, for example, the prostrations, how Jews were looking at that prostration story. That's in Hebrew, right? Uh, and these Christian, how they were looking, that was outside Arabia, right? And we saw the Syriac text being referred to. We saw Egyptian texts being referred to here, like lost texts, right? So the Quranic author has intimate knowledge of these, many of which were untranslated and in different areas. In this case, we saw lost texts, yet the Quran will reference or respond to them. The author of the Quran clearly knew these texts and languages, yet Muhammad couldn't read or write, nor could the Arabs as a whole. In fact, the Arabs were unfamiliar with even the basic biblical stories. This proves Islam, especially when you put it together with the other things we know about Islam in the Quran and Muhammad, like the Quran's literary miracle, the prophecies of Muhammad, the historical miracles of the Quran, which there are a few of, the biblical prophecies of Muhammad, peace be upon him, the message of Islam, and it being far superior to every other religion, the miraculous expansion of Islam, etc., etc. Really, when you put everything together, you would have to, like, there's no way that Muhammad, peace be upon him, was putting all this together. And especially, again, when you take into account his character as well, right? That he was sincere and this and that. And we went over that in the beginning of this video. So that's it for this one. In the next video, I'll do probably 10 more examples. And then there might be there's going to be a video after that too. And then maybe another one after that. So yeah.